Hello, and welcome to this series of films on finding stability in times of change. We live in very difficult times, but we have a God who is faithful and protects us. So I pray that you'll find these films helpful, encouraging and reaffirming of your trust and faith in God. These films have grown out of a quiet day, and so you may like to use them as a structure for your own personal quiet day, making some space for yourself and God amidst all the current difficulties. I'm a reader, a lay minister in the Church of England in Devon, and an oblate, a lay member of a Benedictine monastic community at Alton Abbey in Hampshire. And it's that Benedictine aspect which underpins much of what we'll be considering in the course of these films. There are 3 films in this series. Now in this first one I'll talk a bit about using silence, give an introduction to Benedictine spirituality, and then the first talk on the theme of listening to God. The next film will consider the topic of change, and then a third one on finding stability. Now it may be that something, perhaps just a sentence or a word, will stimulate some thoughts for you to think upon. This is time for you and God. And I would recommend that you find a place for silence in between watching the 3 films. Now, how long that time is entirely up to you, but I would suggest it's maybe at least half an hour. You may like to watch one in the morning, one in the midday, and one in the afternoon, or spread them over 3 days. It's entirely up to you. Whatever deepens your faith and trust in God in these times is the main thing. Now, if you're not used to long periods of silence in prayer or meditation, you may like to try some of the following. So bear in mind that distracting thoughts are quite normal. You'll probably find yourself thinking about other things, people, work, domestic tasks, the TV, coronavirus, etc. Don't worry about having these thoughts, but try to put them to one side and draw your mind back to prayer and meditation by maybe having something to look at, like a candle, using a verse from the Bible, or a simple prayer such as, "Jesus, remember me when I come into your kingdom," or a word like Maranatha, which means "Come, Lord." Simply repeat those words. Or you can imagine the thought is like a leaf floating on a river passing you by. Just let it go past. Don't jump in and grab it. Or you could say hello to the thought and then say, "Right, see you later." You might like to write down your reflections on the talk or the thoughts it's prompted, or read some chapters in the Bible or another book, or to go for a walk, but try not to speak to anyone. Maintain your silence. And don't worry if you fall asleep. That may simply be an indication of just how much you need some rest. Don't force yourself to be holy. And don't worry if nothing happens. So, before we have our first time of prayer, let me say a bit more about Benedictine spirituality. Born in present-day Norcia in central Italy in 480 AD, St. Benedict is generally acknowledged to be the founder of Western monasticism. In the years before his death in 540 AD, he wrote a rule for monks to guide life in a community. Drawn partly from earlier writings, what became called the Rule of St. Benedict covers spiritual and practical aspects of living in community, and became the established norm for monastic living in Europe. Rooted in the Bible, the rule is still used today to provide wisdom and guidance for those in monastic communities, but also for many others who have adopted a similar approach to faith and daily living. In Benedictine spirituality, 3 vows have particular significance and meaning, and the principles of these can be helpful for everyone. Pope Francis describes the meaning of the word obedience very clearly. The word obey comes from Latin, he said. It means to listen, to hear others. Obeying God is listening to God, having an open heart to follow the path that God points out to us. Obedience to God is listening to God, and it sets us free. Under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, conversion of life, or change, is necessary for our relationship with God to grow. As Bishop Richard Moth once put it, conversion is a journey in which we are engaged every day of our lives, even at every moment. Our sense of stability often finds itself dependent on many things: our house, job, finances, the place we live, the people we know, or the church we go to, for example. And when those happen to be threatened, such as by change or uncertainty, life can feel unstable. For all seeking a deeper relationship with God, stability is found by becoming increasingly rooted in the one with whom that relationship is sought. So we can look upon these principles of Benedictine spirituality as threads running through our faith. As we listen to God, we become increasingly aware that in order to change, stability is needed, and in order to be stable, we are also to change. In a few minutes, we'll consider the topic of listening to God, but let's have a moment's quiet just to settle ourselves for the time ahead. There are a couple of things in life that I really dislike. One of them is a hot meal that's already cold by the time I start to eat it. The other is when someone talks over me when I'm speaking. Well, at least I hope you do, or else it's just me. When your sentences are completed by the person you're talking to, or they think that they know what you're trying to say, and then they say it. Such occurrences often indicate that we're not being listened to. And I have to admit that in such circumstances, I have resorted to giving what Paddington Bear would call a hard stare. And then starting my sentence all over again just to make the point. We all do something else too, or at least I hope you do, or else it really is just me. We're with somebody, they're talking, and instead of listening, we're thinking about what to say in response. Then there are those occasions when we've come away from somewhere and not felt listened to at all. It's the verbal equivalent of a hot meal going cold. But I also expect we can all recall times when we felt listened to, and what a difference it made. Mary Lou Casey put it like this: what most people need is a good listening to. And such listening often requires silence. Now, I guess many of you would agree with the principle of that, but silence is often difficult, isn't it? If there's a gap in the conversation, we can feel compelled to fill it rather than experience the awkwardness or embarrassment of what to say next. Being silent takes practice. Rachel Joyce's novel The Music Shop tells how, as a child, the central character Frank would sit with his mum Peg and listen to music. On one occasion, they prepared to listen to Beethoven's Fifth. "Brace yourself," she said. "Here comes the most famous 4 notes in history. Da-da-da-dum." The sound crept out of the silence like a great beast emerging from the sea. Da-da-da-dum. "Hear that?" she said. "You heard the little pause in the middle? There's silence inside music too." Over time, Peg played all the silences she loved. It's a great line, that, isn't it? Played all the silences she loved. Loving silence takes practice. The ability to be silent with others and to be allowed to be silent can often be a true mark of how comfortable we are in someone's company. But if being silent with other people is difficult, then how much more it can be with God, or at least it can seem that way. It is at times undoubtedly difficult to discern what God is saying to us, and how often we complete God's sentences in the process. Now, God does use words and also actions and events and circumstances to speak to us, but as St. John of the Cross put it, silence is the first language of God. Barbara Brown Taylor writes, "Our words are too fragile. God's silence is too deep. Silence is as much a sign of God's presence as of God's absence. Divine silence is not a vacuum to be filled, but a mystery to be entered into." Silence frees us from some of the distractions of everyday life and allows us to listen and give intentional attention to God. And yet, being silent doesn't automatically mean that God will speak. It's easy to think, oh, right, your turn now, God. I'm going to sit here for 10 minutes in silence and I expect to hear from you. I have this lovely image of God turning on that kind of music when you're waiting on the phone. Press 1 for forgiveness, 2 for healing. So we sit in silence, wanting to hear God's voice, just like Samuel. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And we may well hear God's voice in such times, but God also speaks through the earthquake, wind and fire, as Elijah discovered, speaks through the noise that surrounds us, speaks at times when we're not expecting it. Amy Scott Robinson wrote, "If you find yourself in silence at some point today, take a moment to listen to it." An American nun and author Joan Chichester writes, "Silence is a cornerstone of Benedictine life and spiritual development. The rule of St. Benedict does not call for absolute silence. It calls for thoughtful talk." God is always listening to us, and as we talk to God, unlike with other people, it's important that we allow God to speak over what we're saying, for God to complete our sentences for us, to say what we're trying to say. The very first word in the rule of St. Benedict is the word listen, and listen is an anagram of silent. Listening requires silence, and silence enables us to listen. But yes, it's hard, isn't it? Listening when all that's going on around us is tough or changing. A few years ago, I had some hearing tests. I had a sense that perhaps something wasn't quite right, particularly if there was a lot of background noise. I was referred to the hospital and they did a range of tests, all of which were perfectly normal. I sat with the consultant afterwards. "You appear to have an obscure auditory dysfunction," he said. "So you don't know what it is then?" I replied. "Correct," he said magnanimously. "What you need to do is to focus your hearing." So in the same way that I and many of us wear glasses to focus on what we're seeing, so too do we need to focus our hearing. To focus our hearing on listening to God amidst all the noise of our surroundings and the constant chattering of our mind. And that takes practice. But we are, as St. Benedict puts it, to listen with the ear of our heart. For God's words and love are like a hot meal that doesn't go cold, and it's one at which we're invited to eat. So here's some things that you might like to think about. In what ways do you hear God speaking to you? How do you focus your hearing towards God?